Hey everyone, welcome back to Steve's View. The war between the United States, Israel, and Iran has now entered its second week, and in just a matter of days, the strategic landscape of the Middle East may have changed in ways that few people expected. Iran has suffered devastating losses. Its military infrastructure has been heavily damaged. Key command centers have been destroyed. Several senior leaders within the Iranian government and the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps have been eliminated in targeted strikes. And perhaps the most shocking development of all, Iran's supreme leader, Ali Khamenei, was killed during the opening phase of the conflict. His death alone represents one of the most dramatic political moments in the history of the modern Middle East. But the consequences of this war do not stop with Iran. There is another country that may also be taking a major strategic hit from this conflict, and that country is China. At first glance, that might sound surprising. China is not directly involved in the fighting. Chinese forces are not operating in the Persian Gulf. There are no Chinese aircraft carriers launching strikes in the region. In fact, compared with the military activity we're seeing from United States and Israel, Beijing has appeared remarkably quiet. So the question naturally arises, if China has stayed out of the war, how could it possibly be one of the countries most affected by it? The answer lies in three interconnected issues: energy security, geopolitical influence in the Middle East, and the long-term strategic rivalry between China and the United States. Let's start with the most immediate concern: energy. China is one of the largest energy importers in the world. Its massive industrial economy runs on oil and natural gas, much of which must be shipped from overseas. And for years, Iran has been one of China's most important energy partners. Despite international sanctions, China has remained one of the biggest buyers of Iranian oil. In many recent years, China has purchased roughly 80 to 90% of Iran's oil exports. That makes China not just a customer, but essentially the backbone of Iran's oil economy. At the same time, Iranian crude has also played an important role inside China's own energy supply system. Estimates vary, but Iranian oil has often accounted for around 10 to 12% of China's total imported oil. That may not sound overwhelming at first, but in the global energy market, even a disruption of a few percentage points can have massive ripple effects. And that's exactly the risk this war creates, because the conflict isn't just happening inside Iran. It's unfolding in one of the most strategically important regions on Earth, the Persian Gulf. Right at the center of this region lies one of the world's most critical maritime choke points, the Strait of Hormuz. Every day, roughly 1/5 of the world's traded oil passes through this narrow waterway. Tankers from Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Kuwait, the United Arab Emirates, and Iran all pass through it on their way to global markets. If this strait were disrupted, even temporarily, the consequences for the global economy would be immediate. Oil prices would spike, shipping costs would soar, insurance rates for tankers would skyrocket, and countries that rely heavily on imported energy, especially China, would feel the impact almost immediately. Even if the strait remains technically open, a prolonged war in the region could still raise transportation costs and inject enormous uncertainty into global energy markets. For a country like China, whose economic growth depends on stable energy supplies, that alone represents a major strategic risk. But energy is only part of the story. Over the past decade, China has invested enormous diplomatic effort into expanding its influence in the Middle East. Unlike the Cold War era, when China had relatively little presence in the region, Beijing has gradually built relationships with nearly every major power there. China has become the largest trading partner for many Middle Eastern countries. Chinese companies have invested in infrastructure, ports, railways, and energy projects across the region as part of the broader Belt and Road Initiative. Perhaps the most dramatic example of China's growing diplomatic influence came in 2023, when Beijing successfully mediated a historic rapprochement between Saudi Arabia and Iran. After years of hostility and proxy conflicts, the two regional rivals agreed to restore diplomatic relations in a deal brokered by China. At the time, many observers described the agreement as a major diplomatic victory for Beijing. It suggested that China was beginning to play a larger role in shaping the political order of the Middle East, an area traditionally dominated by the United States. But that delicate balance could now be at risk. If Iran's government is severely weakened by this war, or if its political system becomes unstable after the death of Khamenei, China may suddenly lose one of its most important strategic partners in the region. And that would matter a great deal. Iran has long been one of the few major Middle Eastern states willing to cooperate closely with China, despite pressure from the United States. While China maintains strong economic ties with countries like Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, those governments are also closely aligned with Washington. Iran, by contrast, has often positioned itself as part of a broader camp of states that oppose U.S. dominance in global politics. In other words, Iran has been one of China's most useful geopolitical partners in the Middle East. If that partner is weakened, or if a new government in Tehran takes a different direction, China's strategic position in the region could become far more uncertain. And that leads to the third issue, the broader strategic rivalry between China and the United States. For years now, relations between Washington and Beijing have been defined by growing competition across multiple arenas: trade, technology, military power, and global influence. The United States remains the world's most powerful military actor, with a vast network of alliances stretching across Europe, Asia, and the Middle East. China, meanwhile, has been rapidly expanding its economic reach and modernizing its armed forces. But despite China's growing power, there is still a significant gap between the two countries when it comes to global military presence. The United States maintains major military bases throughout the Middle East. American aircraft carriers regularly patrol the region. U.S. forces cooperate closely with allies such as Israel, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates. If Iran, the most powerful regional opponent of U.S. influence, were seriously weakened, that could strengthen America's strategic position in the Middle East even further. And that, in turn, could have consequences far beyond the region itself. Because if the United States no longer needs to devote as many resources to containing Iran, it could shift more attention and military capacity toward other theaters, especially the Indo-Pacific. That is precisely the region where China and the United States are already competing most intensely. In other words, the outcome of this war could indirectly shape the balance of power in Asia. So when you look at the situation from Beijing's perspective, the stakes are quite high. Which brings us to the most puzzling question of all. If this war carries such serious implications for China, why hasn't China done more to support Iran? So far, Beijing has offered relatively mild diplomatic criticism of the strikes carried out by the United States and Israel. Chinese officials have called for restraint and urged all sides to avoid further escalation. But beyond those statements, China has not taken any visible steps to provide military assistance to Iran. There has been no deployment of Chinese naval forces to the Persian Gulf, no announcement of weapons shipments, no military advisors sent to Tehran, and certainly no Chinese troops entering the conflict. This stands in stark contrast to another example from the current geopolitical landscape. In the war in Ukraine, North Korea has reportedly sent troops to assist Russia, a move that dramatically escalated Pyongyang's involvement in that conflict. China, by comparison, has been far more cautious. So why? The first reason is structural. Despite their cooperation, China and Iran are not formal military allies. China has never extended a security guarantee to Iran. There is no treaty requiring China to defend Iran if it comes under attack. Unlike the alliance system of NATO, which commits members to collective defense, China's foreign policy has traditionally emphasized non-alignment and the avoidance of binding military commitments. Even though China and Iran signed a long-term cooperation agreement in 2021. That deal focused primarily on economic investment, energy cooperation, and infrastructure development, not mutual defense. In other words, from a legal and institutional standpoint, China has no obligation to intervene militarily on Iran's behalf. The second reason is strategic risk. Any serious Chinese military involvement in the war, whether through weapons transfers, intelligence sharing, or naval escorts, would almost certainly bring China into direct confrontation with the United States. And for Beijing, that is a risk it is simply not prepared to take in the Middle East. China's most critical strategic theater lies much closer to home, particularly in the Western Pacific. Issues such as the future of Taiwan, territorial disputes in the South China Sea, and the broader military balance in East Asia are far more central to China's long-term security calculations. Opening a new front of confrontation with the United States thousands of miles away in the Persian Gulf would stretch Chinese capabilities and potentially undermine those priorities. The third reason is that China itself has mixed feelings about Iran. While the two countries cooperate closely in certain areas, Beijing has never viewed Tehran as a completely reliable partner. Iran's foreign policy has often been highly confrontational, particularly toward its regional rivals. Its nuclear program has triggered repeated international crises, and its relationships with other Middle Eastern states remain tense. From China's perspective, this creates a delicate balancing act. Beijing maintains deep economic ties not only with Iran, but also with many of Iran's rivals, including Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. China imports large volumes of oil from those countries as well. If China were to openly side with Iran in a major war, it could jeopardize those relationships and undermine China's broader diplomatic strategy in the region. Finally, there is a more subtle factor that sometimes shapes great power behavior: strategic patience. From a purely realist perspective, some policymakers in Beijing may believe that prolonged instability in the Middle East could actually produce indirect advantages for China. If the United States becomes deeply entangled in another long conflict in the region, it could divert American resources, attention, and political focus away from Asia. History offers an interesting precedent here. During the Iraq War, the United States devoted enormous military and financial resources to operations in the Middle East for nearly a decade. During that same period, China experienced one of the fastest phases of economic growth in its modern history, expanding its global trade networks and rapidly increasing its industrial capacity. Some strategists in Beijing may quietly wonder whether a similar dynamic could emerge again. That does not mean China welcomes chaos in the Middle East, but it does mean that Beijing may be willing to adopt a wait-and-see approach, rather than rushing into direct involvement. There is also another reality worth considering. The relationship between China and Iran has never been entirely symmetrical. Iran depends on China far more than China depends on Iran. China remains one of the very few major economies willing to purchase large quantities of Iranian oil despite sanctions. Chinese companies continue to trade with Iran when many Western firms cannot. For Iran, maintaining access to the Chinese market is essential. For China, however, Iranian oil represents only one component of a much larger global supply network that includes Russia, Saudi Arabia, Iraq, and many other producers. That imbalance gives Beijing considerable flexibility in how it manages the relationship. All of this leads to a broader conclusion about the current global order. In recent years, China has worked to expand its influence through international platforms such as the Shanghai Cooperation Organization and BRICS. These institutions are often portrayed as emerging alternatives to Western-dominated political and economic structures. But the events unfolding in Iran highlight an important reality. Despite China's growing economic power and diplomatic reach, the United States still retains an unmatched ability to project military force on a global scale. The rapid and devastating strikes carried out against Iranian targets demonstrate just how large that gap remains. For now, at least, China appears unwilling to challenge that military dominance directly, especially in regions far from its own shores, and that may be one of the most important lessons emerging from this war. The conflict between the United States, Israel, and Iran is reshaping the strategic landscape of the Middle East. But it is also revealing something deeper about the balance of power in the international system. China may be rising, but the era in which it is ready to confront the United States militarily across the globe may still lie somewhere in the future. Thanks for watching.